Last time we left off with a bit of discussion about a painting. The question is, which painting is it? Here we have the storming of the Teocalli by Cortes and his troops by Emmanuel Lutz in 1848. The painting is produced in the 19th century. It's not produced during the period of Cortes's time. It's telling a story. It's telling a story that is dramatic about the defeat of the Aztec Empire, so to speak. Now, Aztec is actually a Spanish word. The indigenous term is Nahuatl, and Nahuatl is also a term that is used in contemporary Mexico as well. So the people who were part of this empire did not simply disappear. And in fact, we know that the collapse of the Aztec Empire was not due to Spanish conquest dramatically. It was gradual, it was over time, and there were other factors involved, such as disease and so forth, political strife, these type of problems. Consequently, the painting is telling this narrative of sort of European supremacy here. So that's something to keep in mind, that there was a reshaping of history. And this is what Robert Marx is trying to critique, that history can be given a more accurate sort of narrative spin than the one that is commonly presented. So we're going to critique some myths. When we talk about historical myths are essentially ideas that are commonly presented as history, but professional historians like myself myth bust, essentially, to keep it colloquial. So there's a narrative called The Rise of the West. This narrative was created by previous generations of historians. It was intended to explain the origins of European colonial power. But we now know as a field and basically agree that it was rooted in a fundamental error. The error is that Europeans' quote rise to power began with the Spanish conquest of the Americas. This is false. First of all, there's not really a European rise to power in a unified sense. Europe never really gets unified. That's one thing to consider. Even under the European Union, the attempts to unify Europe are mediocre. A second sort of problem here is there ever a rise of the West? Is there ever a conquest of the Aztecs? Well, sort of. What's the error? You're missing the Great Dying, where 90% of the Central American population died as a result of disease from interactions between populations which had developed certain types of immunities to some diseases, but not other types of immunities to other diseases. Second, there's also a mega drought. Now, we heard that influenza was perhaps a factor, perhaps smallpox, that's possible. But actually, our current working hypothesis is that there was an indigenous contemporary hemorrhagic fever. And this comes from Rodolfo Acuna Soto, David W. Stahl, Malcolm K. Cleveland, and Matthew D. Therrell from 2002, from the publication Megadrought and Megadeath in the 16th Century of Mexico, where they're discussing emerging infectious diseases. A hemorrhagic fever that is indigenous would not be brought by Europeans, but just happened to have an outbreak at that time. It's really a matter of sort of coincidence and environmental factors than other factors. There's really a revolutionary historical research that was presented in that paper in 2002. So this is a new understanding that we have of that particular event that critiques the rise of the West. Another part of the rise of the West narrative is episode 2. Now, of course, you have the French Revolution. This is very important. The French Revolution from 1789 to 1799 brings the modern nation-state ideals of equality, liberty, and brotherhood, supposedly. But there is a bit of a problem here. Go ahead and look at the image. What do you see? You could post about what you see in the image, what jumps out to you about the image. I will tell you that it's the Incendie de la Plaine de Cap, which is the massacre of slave-holding populations by formerly enslaved populations on the island of Haiti on August 22nd of 1791. The photo itself, the image itself, the likeness, the sketch itself is produced by a French perspective, of course, here. And the French Revolution is quite important, but actually the whole idea about the French Revolution dramatically shaking things up completely ignores the fact that there's also a Haitian Revolution that dramatically shakes things up as well. It begins actually before the French Revolution ends. So there's this idea of, okay, well, if there's liberté, égalité, fraternité, what about the idea of people being enslaved? Don't they also deserve equality, liberty, and brotherhood? That influences this sort of rise of the Haitian Revolution. Of course, we have an in-house expert on the history of Haiti, so I would recommend taking a class with Dr. Philippe Girard if you are interested in this subject. But it's perhaps most defining in terms of creating this moment where there is a rise of racist sentiment, modern racism, as a feature of the history of the Atlantic world. You can see from French colonialist perspectives, you have a description at the bottom of the image, which describes people as white and black as two distinct categories. That's not a category that is conceived of as such in terms of its modern conception of racism really before this revolutionary period and the French reaction to it, which is quite dramatic. So that creation of racism out of that revolution and the reaction to the revolution from the French perspective is also quite important in American history as well, where there's racism before this to a certain extent, but there's really sort of modern racism that gets created throughout the early 19th century. We'll see that as an emerging theme, and then of course the anti-racist responses moving forward. We'll also talk about other revolutions and rebellions that take place in the 18th century worldwide. Another important narrative here, of course, is the rise of the West and the narrative of the Industrial Revolution. There is this argument that Adam Smith, Thomas Malthus, and David Ricardo see the sort of ideas of capitalism and modern capitalism, even though Adam Smith is actually a critic of what we would now call capitalism. He doesn't support it. He's a critic of it, but that's beyond the point. That these ideas are sort of seeded in Europe and Europe and America are progressive, while the rest of the world is sort of backward and despotic. Well, what about Haiti? It's a modern republic. What about Liberia? It's a modern republic. Russia is part of Europe, sure, in terms of population, but the geography is mostly in Asia. What about the governance of the Qing Empire, which is relatively centralized, yes, but is quite respectful to certain types of religious minorities? What about the Mughals in India, which are quite respectful of religious minorities, and so on? There is an argument that has been created within the past decade or 2 decades that essentially syncretism and religious tolerance in India and China are just as much historical precedents to modern secularism as, say, the catalyst of the Protestant Reformation. Now, of course, there is a sort of problem with modern secularism as well. You have states like the United States, for example, that have no national religion and no sense that there should be a national religion, and yet the separation of church and state is not maintained in portions of the United States. Utah, for example, the state government of Utah is famously in constant contestation with this idea of having a secular state. So the idea that there's going to be a secular state is sort of contested even in contemporary contexts. And it's problematized, but there is a sort of gradual emergence of it. Yes, there is. Now, this Industrial Revolution, let's pick it apart about it. The theorists, Smith, Malthus, Ricardo, have their different perspectives, but it's really scholars who are reading these theorists who create this idea that capitalism, quote unquote, is linked to progress theoretically. We'll be doing some critique of that. They see Europe as progressive. They see the rest as not. And we will problematize this because really, if you begin to delve into the history of India, you find that secularism, the modern secular state is very much rooted in Indian history as well, and not so much British history. Regardless, we will move forward here, and we will continue to discuss these topics throughout the course.